So today's keynote speaker will need no introduction to many of you. Audrey Zibelman was the CEO and Managing Director of the Australian Energy Market Operator from 2016 to 2020, where she established the Integrated System Plan, which is the 20-year roadmap for decarbonising Australia's national power system. Before joining AEMO, she was the chair of the New York Public Service Commission, where she was a member of the Governor's Cabinet and regulated the electricity, gas, water, steam and communications utilities in New York. There she led regulatory reform of the electricity industry to support a decarbonised grid, known as New York's Reforming the Energy Vision. I'm seeing a trend here. Audrey is currently a board member and advisor to multiple companies in the US, Australia and Europe, leading on climate change, including RMI, Pollination Group, Span.io, Sostenio, Landis & Gyr, SunPower and Squadron Energy. She is also a member of US President Joe Biden's National Infrastructure Advisory Council and advised the White House on the Inflation Reduction Act. She was also vice president at X, not that one, the other one. That's Alphabet's Moonshot Factory, where she advised on breakthrough climate technology, including Tapestry, X's project to digitize the electricity grid. This is kind of one of those introductions where I could probably easily burn about 5 minutes just cutting into the fireside chat, but I'm not going to do that because I know that Audrey is super keen to talk, to have a discussion and to hear your questions in particular. So please welcome Audrey Zibelman. Let's start with the big one. In this day and age, we were discussing, and Brendan was talking about this, energy is, I guess, the fundamental enabling factor for all of us, for everything that we need and we enjoy. But as Brendan was saying, we're seeing a lot of disparity in access to this. Should we be framing energy as a right here in Australia?
First of all, thanks everybody. It's wonderful to be here and see, and hope to catch up with a lot of friends. And also, happy Valentine's Day. We just don't do these things here like we do in the US, but I like the red chair. Look, you know, I love Brendan's comments, and it made me think about it because in terms of the issue of disconnection and connection and access. You know, there's a few ways I think about this. The first is the fact that from a pure economic basis, right, we cannot have economic wealth in any country without access to reliable, affordable energy. It is actually the whole concept of energy is turning something that you get out of the ground into a good. And this is also the concept of an economy. So there's actually a wonderful book written by a Canadian economist about that he talks about the fact that actually energy and economy are synonymous, and you can't have an economy without energy. It's a period. So yes, is it a public right? Has to be, otherwise we wouldn't have an economy. But the other thing is it's long time been recognized that access and universal access is an essential right in any society. And I was thinking, you know, it's almost a decade ago, in the 1930s, that Franklin Roosevelt took a look at the fact that 80% of people who lived in urban core in the United States had access to electricity through the process of electrification. And in the US, of course, it started as investment-owned utilities, private companies who were given franchise rights to provide electricity. But those companies could not find an economic case to provide power to rural communities simply because they were so sparse. And so because he wanted to make sure there was universal access, Roosevelt created the Rural Electrification Act, in which the federal government funded to make sure there was universal access to power. So I think this idea of is it a right, it absolutely is. We can't have economic growth without it, economic well-being. But the other piece is we have to make sure it's equitable. It can't be a situation, and I think Brendan's comments alluded to this, is that we have a point where only certain people have access to what we want to have, which is a distributed power system, and others people do not. And so we need to start changing the dialogue of what universal access means. And it can't be just meaning access to the grid. It has to be access to consumer energy resources. It has to be access to electrification. And I'll leave it there because that's where I think is one piece that the conversation just has to change, and there are good reasons for that.
Have you seen any good mechanisms elsewhere in the world to sort of enshrine those rights to affordable and reliable energy?
Well, in the States, in New York, for example, but all the states have statutory obligations on the part of utilities to provide access to universal access. So it's actually embedded in statutes, and utilities will lose their franchise if they fail to do it. And I think it needs to be embedded in a statutory right. What we need to start thinking about is how do we redefine that in light of the changes that need to happen on the power system.
So I guess in many ways this is sort of the $24,000 question. Like what does a good energy future look like for consumers? Does it look like more, you were talking about regulatory earlier, does it look like more government intervention?
Yeah, so let me back up and maybe talk about it at 50,000 foot scale, and particularly as it pertains to Australia. So one of the things that we recognized in 2016 at AEMO as we started to do the economic analysis. And for Australia, because of the fact that we have such a great climate for wind and solar, it didn't make any sense as we thought about fossil fuel plants aging and retiring to replace them with coal. That wind and solar and storage was the economic decision, economic solution. But also, of course, was the environmental solution. And as we've discovered yesterday in Victoria, but there have been multiple studies, the cost of climate change itself is a tax on society. Recovering from the climate events like yesterday's storms, which are just getting worse. So not moving into a decarbonized grid doesn't make any sense, certainly from an economic perspective here and in many other parts of the world. But it doesn't also make sense from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective when we think about the cost of living in a climate where we don't achieve Paris targets. So all of that says we need to make that energy transition. However, when you move to renewables, one of the things that happens is you lose the fact that you have dispatchable resources. And you need to make the grid itself very flexible. You need to be able to shift demand in order to respond to the situation that's happening on supply. So it's a total reverse of how we engineered the power system in the 20th century, where we had generation that essentially responded to demand, which was inelastic. Now we have the capability to make demand highly elastic and be able to respond to what's happening on the grid. If you combine that with the need for resiliency, increased resiliency, which we can get from consumer energy resources, I think the point then becomes is one, having full access to CER and finding the right policies to get there, having full access to electrification and finding the right policies to get there, is no longer sort of want to have, hopefully they do, let's give the incentives, let's make the people in the community really worry about it, but actually becomes a government obligation around how do we deliver power in a way that's economically efficient and equitable. So it's not reinventing the right, it's actually recognizing with the shifts in technology, how we deliver that right, that essential service, needs to be totally rethought because the power system was designed around an economic efficient outcome in the way that economic efficiency could be delivered in the 20th century when central station power plants was the most economic thing to do. That's simply just not the case anymore, and nor is it the moral imperative we have in this generation. And so we have to, so when I think about the role of government, back to your question, it's what is the role of government in creating the demand and regulatory structures that allow for the delivery of that good in the most efficient way. And I think we know how to do that. This is one of the things that I sort of struggle with, which is why we are forgetting. So when we recognized that it was really important for us on a societal basis that everyone have access to broadband, we didn't wait for everyone to call up and say, I'm ready for broadband, can you get it to my home? We created an institution in the form of Australia, NBN, to get to that last mile. when we wanted to make sure that there was universal access to electricity, we didn't wait for everyone to call up and say, can I get a distribution line down my street? We created monopolies who could deliver it efficiently. So the question then becomes, what are the structures that we can use? And we also used it, by the way, in the 90s, when everyone said we want to incent renewables. Government created the demand in the form of RETs here, renewable targets in the US, that told people, this is how much we need you to deliver. So the question for me is, what is then the obligation and who should hold it to say, over the next 20, 30 years, we need to give universal access to CR. What's the most economically efficient way to do this? How do we unroll it in an efficient way? Because I think an honest network would tell you, life would be a lot easier if they knew they needed to deliver to a target and what they needed to deliver, and then we could create markets, because I could tell you that capitalists, if we said, we are gonna go and get moved towards, this community is going all electric, and people are gonna be able to bid in to provide those services, you'll have infrastructure investors coming in. What they can't do is do one by one, and if we do it in that reverse order, we don't have individuals then having to worry and deal with the complexity. We take that complexity away because we think of it as a societal good. So that's the way I think we need, when we talk about ambitious change, I think the ambition has to be where we really need to rethink what problem we're solving, and then use the tools of government apparatus, which we've used before to enable demand in markets, to do it most efficiently.
It's interesting, I mean, CER is obviously one of our favorite topics. It's interesting you talked about that. Like, from what we're seeing a lot of at the moment is that it seems that the energy transition is kind of focused on the big end of town. Like, there's the supply side. And that's sort of how we've seen it, which aligns with how the system has sort of traditionally been, I guess. And most of the conversation is around large-scale generation and transmission. But when we look at the integrated system plan, like, perhaps some of the biggest opportunities, certainly for consumers, are around consumer energy resources. So how do we shift that gauge to focus less on the tech and more on the right methods of tech deployment? Like, what needs to happen to enable consumers to realize those opportunities?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to note, well, I think there's still a lot of technology that we need to develop. The technology we need to do this is here. So it's not like, and that's one of my concerns, is the fact that sometimes people talk about we have to invent all this technology, which gives people a pass to say, well, the technology is not here, we can't act. We can act, and frankly, if we create act and create demand, I can tell you on the supply side, people will get a lot more innovative faster. So I think that's an important point. But to me, you know, one of the things, if I were sort of could, you know, sort of think about what I did in New York. So in New York, we made a determination that it was in the public interest to move to distributed energy resources. This was after Hurricane Sandy. It was way too expensive to rebuild the grid, and we needed to make sure there was sufficient resiliency. But I didn't go far enough, because all I did is provide incentives to utilities to say that if they put in behind the meter, supported behind the meter programs that were economically efficient, their return on investment would be higher than it would be if they used traditional investment. I wanted to align them with consumers, but I don't, in retrospect, and I could give myself a pass, it was early days, it was 2013, but we should have gone further. I think the further would have been if we did with the consumer side like we did with renewables. So New York set ambitious targets around renewables, but we didn't set ambitious targets around DER. And so if we said that we wanted to say by this date, we want 20% of New York's population to have DER access, and we wanted to do it efficiently like we did with smart meters and rolled them out, we would have gotten further. And then we could have said, and by this date, we want 50%, and by this date, we want to get to 100%. Because one of the things that you need to do to make this kind of transition, if you think of all transitions have an S-curve, where things go slow and then they go fast. We needed to identify what the fast track is for any transition, and it usually starts with some form of government setting the demand and saying, this is where we want to go. We want everyone to have access to EVs. So California's great at that. By 2035, can't sell petrol cars in California. That means everyone's adopting EVs. We need to be thinking about what's that equivalent on the consumer side and say, that's how we're going to define good. And now we could start defining the policy, the actions that deliver that good in the most efficient way. And I feel like until, and I assume this organization is going to have a big piece of that, we can get people to recognize that's not only good from an environmental standpoint, but it's good from an economic. It'll be easier then for the next pieces to happen.
So if we put in place those things, if we put in place, the regulation and the government frameworks and the other things that are needed, do you think that the integrated system plan assumptions about CER will be met?
Well, I think that if we say, look, this is where we want Australia to be, in fact, and I'll say a couple of points about why that's important. One is, we've already proven in Australia that getting rooftop solar at scale drives a whole lot of efficiency, and you can run a grid with it. We just need to get enough storage in the system, and we need to look at electrification. But it actually helps quite a bit. But we need to make that demand flexible so we can deal with both minimum demand issues as well as peak issues. So I think that Australia can lead in that. The other area where Australia is already leading is actually in some of the programs that have been put in place, like Project Edge, where we're talking about how do we integrate DER better into the grid. The problem is uptake. And uptake is some of the hardest societal questions. I mean, we know, for example, that more efficient homes is the cheapest and easiest way to drive down both emissions but also drive down costs. But getting that uptake of people to make that capital play is very difficult, so just why I think thinking about it as how else do we do that is really important. And so to me, if we were to create these mechanisms where I would say we would work with the networks and say we want to create make-ready environments and create situations where people can go all electric, and we'll create structures that allow it to be accessible. So it's not an individual capital cost, but it's sort of a societal benefit that gets monetized. I think we will get those CER uptake, but until we I think, make this bit of a leap that this isn't a nice to have, this has really got to be a societal gotta have, it'll be hard going. Because to ask people to stop and do these things is really difficult. And I think you heard from some of the consumers, and I see this in the US too, all these people say, I really want to go all electric, but it's hard. And so you're only going to get a subset of society. You're not going to get people who are really busy there until we make it easy. And that's where I go back to NBN. We wouldn't have made this switch if we made it hard for folks to switch.
So I'm going to seize on something you said earlier, just about, you mentioned the networks. What is the role of the networks in all of this?
Well, I think there's a couple things that we need that the networks can do. One is, and there's an example in Vermont where an investor-owned utility, Green Mountain Power, actually did the calculus and determined that putting solar and storage in people's homes in Vermont was economically cheaper for running the grid than putting up more new infrastructure. And so I do think that there's an opportunity, and this would be a regulatory change, but it's what we did in New York, and I won't go into how do we do it here. Yeah. But there's one is to say we want the networks to be in a position where they're creating the structure and the plans, essentially the network version of the ISPs, that gets us to the point that we can move towards 100% CER adoption and electrification. So we need to understand everyone should have, that should be very transparent. Then I think the other piece is around digitalization, which is something I've been harping on for a while. This is running power systems that are distributed and renewal is a big data issue. And so the UK Ofgem has done this beautiful piece of work around creating a digital spine Actually, Project Edge is a lot of that. And so we should be thinking about how do we make data very exchangeable and easy, because we're going to need to have it happen, but also transparency, so that if people understand what kind of resources would be most valuable, then market players wouldn't have to guess as to how much storage and solar and where we should put things and how do we need to manage the grid. So I think we need the networks to be able to agree around working with AEMO and government is how do we create data access and make it that much easier, and not have, and this is another piece, if we develop the internet, we developed a set of protocols that work the same everywhere, universally. There's an international society. And so that way, when you hook things up to the internet, it's not like, oh, this is different than there. That's why we have credit cards. It's why our phones work the same way. It's all because of universal standards. So one of the areas I think we need to do around the networks is get them to adopt, because there are standards around DER and CER, so that it's easy to plug in, and we're not having to basically reconfigure things like smart dishwashers. In Australia, it works the same here as it works in California and everywhere else. That takes cost out of the system. But the other role that I think the networks could play is if they could facilitate the use of DER, and this would be a regulatory change, and put it into their RAB as well as EVs, which will be the next big challenge, so that they can make it easier for that to happen. Then maybe it's a way of driving electrification a lot more efficiently, because they are monopolies, and we've basically made the decision that it's cheaper for society for us to have more flexible load than to build more substations or put more transmission in and things like that. So it's a public good that should be socialized. So that would be a piece that I would think about as the role of network. So one is to be the facilitator of DER as an access to the system and being able to use it both for reliability and economics. The second is to support a digitalization play where we actually are looking at easy exchange of data and systems were not bespoke, but actually probably should be the same universally on how data shows up on the grid and can be exchanged. And then I would also look at giving networks the economic incentive so that if they use DER more so than putting in distribution systems, that is actually better for their shareholders as well as for their customers. So we align those interests as another area.
Yeah. You're talking about data access. I'm interested in sort of looking at data access from a consumer point of view, because something we're seeing coming up in our research recently into consumer attitudes towards consumer energy resources is a consumer unease around privacy and control. And particularly the idea of allowing someone control of appliances inside their homes. This comes in the wake of some major data breaches in Australia. We've seen some pretty bad ones. In your opinion, what are the guardrails and the safety nets that we need to build into our thinking and our regulations to make sure that we respect consumer agency?
Sure, and that's a really important question, as well as cybersecurity. So I have to acknowledge I'm on the board of SPAN.io, so that this comes from the heart for me, and one of the reasons I joined SPAN is the fact that I think the way this needs to work, and I've never been a fan of time of use rates because I think it's hard for consumers. I think what SPAN is, it's essentially a smart panel. So what we recognize is that when we put solar and storage on people's roof, you have to rewire the home. It's very expensive, but you have a lot of excess capacity in your home. So SPAN is actually a smart electric panel. And one of the things that it does, and it's not the only one, is it optimizes how load is used in your home in response to a price signal. So rather than thinking about taking control, what it is, and to me the future of this is simply the same thing. The market is going to be going away from sort of energy, because we're not going to be using fuel, to flexibility and capacity. In individuals' homes, I think the future is to say, these are my comfort levels for my thermostat. Nest has been doing this forever, Apple Nest thermostats. This is what I want my temperature to be. I need my car charged at 6 a.m. Thank you very much. And I'm okay if you want to cycle off and off my pool pumps and my refrigerator and all that. I really don't care, as long as my beer is cold or white wine or whatever you want. And that's all customers fundamentally care about. If you start your dishwasher after dinner and the dishwasher says, hey, it's kind of expensive, let's wait. I don't think people are going to sit there and say, no, I need my dishes washed. And if they do, they just override it. And so I feel like it's all about simplicity and the optimization, and that's where technology has enabled it. And so to me, the consumer privacy issue is the consumer still has total agency of their comfort and ease. It's just that the devices are smarter and are responding to the price signals to do what they need to do. And so I don't see that as an issue, because once we move to this level of digitalization, we are going to insert this intelligence into the home. And from a consumer standpoint, I could tell you as a consumer, I wouldn't want to mess with it. If I was told, look, you're going to get a $50 electricity bill, but it's not really, it's for your appliances and everything else. It's fixed. You just tell us what your temperature is, you tell us when you're traveling, and that's on an app, you're done. And I think that's where technology and digitalization can lead us, as opposed to thinking this is more complex. It's one of the things I did learn as a regulator. Normal people think about power about 4 minutes a year, period. They really don't want to think about it more than that. And so our job is really to make it simple, not to make it more complex and scary.
I have one more question for you, and then we're going to get to the audience questions, because people have been busily sending in their questions. We've got a lot to get through. We won't get through all of them, but we'll try that. What should we be learning as a country from the Inflation Reduction Act? Like, what's been the impact there for consumers? What can Australia do? Yeah,
so the Inflation Reduction Act is a very much a U.S. sort of derived need, is that the U.S. market is extremely fragmented, between the federal government and the states, and particularly when it comes around to energy, very hard to do that. So the best thing that the U.S. government can do to animate capital is to put government capital to work to bring in private capital. So the Inflation Reduction Act is designed around how to drive a transition in the U.S. given the structure of the U.S. markets. And there's a lot of work going in, but we're sort of stalled, and actually the money isn't flowing as quickly as people would like. And it's hard because now people have to apply for grants. So it's really, I wouldn't advise it. But the bigger thing, it's not necessary for Australia. Australia, because of the size of our economy, and also because we only have 7 states, we can be very nimble. And I think, so the advantage that we have as a nation is several. One is, again, best land in the world to put in wind, solar, hydro, offshore wind. Everyone looks at us, and I could tell you the investment community, when Australia says we want to do these projects, they want to come because they could see they could actually create projects here. So that is not our problem, even rooftop solar, battery storage, not our problem. What we need is regulatory and market design, which we should be able to get to. And because the issue is how to get efficient capital into the market. And for us, it's not because people would be incredulous that we want to put in this much renewables. They know we can do so technically, as well as distributed energy resources. We have a very advanced economy. It's a question as to the regulatory and market design support that. And I feel like would be the missed opportunity for us to not be willing to step back, as Louise said, and just take a look at this and recognize it's not working for the future. I have a friend that Lynn and I know in common who works at one of the labs in California, and says one it would be the shame is as if we sometimes he thinks we're thinking about walking into the transition backwards. In other words, we keep looking back to what we did and trying to change that, versus looking forward and say, where are we headed and how do we get there? And that's where I think Australia, really, their answer to the IRA is to develop the policy processes, markets, to move fast.
Okay, well, our first question fits really nicely with that. Where does, Anonymous asks, where does efficient electrification fit into the policy picture? So you've talked about settings for consumer energy resources, but I couldn't say thermal efficiency of existing housing stock have a material impact on generation, storage and firming capacity.
Yeah. So I think it's a great question, and my bad for not mentioning it. One of the things that Rocky Mountain Institute has always been known for is radical efficiency, is getting to efficient usage, and it is the first thing we should be doing. So when I talk about these programs, we need to be, as part of this programmatic way of looking at, is how to drive efficiency in buildings and usage. And it should be part of that. It shouldn't be a side. We need to make our homes more efficient. And a study I was just showing Louise we've done is, in order to hit 1.5, if we continue to do things like we are, we'll get there by 30. We won't get there. The one thing we have to do in order to hit where we want to go on emissions is drive efficiencies in buildings. And so we're not, in the end, waiting for individuals who have precious little time, in many cases not enough capital to do it, or many renters who don't have that choice, we've run out of time for that. It hasn't worked in the last 30 years, and it won't work now. We have to drive to a much more programmatic way, in creating structures like that we have in Oregon to make that happen.
Got another question here, kind of linked to that, I think. What social equity measures do you think might be needed in universal CER, like targeting access to low-income households, but also the barriers around tenure and dwelling type and household composition, like for renters and apartments? Sure.
So I think that the way that we would have to do it, again, is just decide that there's going to be universal access, and then design the programs around the decision, rather than thinking we're going to create incentives and we'll get there. So the IRA has done, has allocated $40 billion to community organizations to drive electrification in hard to electrify homes and low income, particularly targeting equity communities. But it's not going to be, and this is my concern, enough unless we change the structures and the concept of what a public good looks like. And so we saw this, and that was, to me, with internet access, internet poverty was a huge issue, and still is. And there are many, many parts of, you can't get a job without access to Wi-Fi, and a lot of people couldn't afford it. We just can't do that on energy.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. So I think that what we need to do in any public policy is say, as we're moving towards distributed energy, we need to make sure that renters and low-income communities are taken care of. And that, to me, the most efficient way to deliver capital, and I am a former regulator, so I'm not going to get over that, but utilities are really efficient at delivering programs. And we should think about how we can use them rather than create new structures, or if we do that, make it something like the Oregon Trust that has that obligation.
Yeah, I've got a follow-up question on that one. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah.
How do we, in Europe, how do we decide universal access? Like, what does that look like?
Everyone has access.
Yeah.
I mean, make it really simple.
Yeah, but do we codify it into regulation? Do we make it in laws? How do we kind of bake that in?
I should know this because I lived here for 4 years, but I mean, in the US, it's just statutory.
Yeah.
Every state has a law that says if you want a franchise to sell electricity as a network company or a utility, you have to provide access to every consumer, period. It's not a debatable issue. You lose your franchise. Now, there are bad policies around disconnect that we should deal with, and I think Brendan's right to point that out, but I think getting access should just be, everyone should get it.
Yeah, okay. We've got another question here. So someone says, in this room we all understand what the transition is, but outside there are some fundamental misunderstandings that are holding us back. What do Australians need to know about the transition, particularly in regional Australia, and who would be the best person to tell them?
Well, this is, to me, the other piece of this, and it's a mindset issue, right? We've made a mistake always when we do, in making things like access to rooftop solar seen as a technical issue that only early adopters do. And we also, of course, the way we've done about it, it's the highest level incomes got first, and we saw it as a capacity issue. I wonder, and this is, and I know Energy Consumers has done an awful lot of work on behavioral economics. It's beautiful work. That if we move to this thing, that's saying we're moving towards universal electrification, and we design programs to tell people that actually you can cook really well in induction ovens, your food's going to taste great. We can design these programs. What would happen is that we create a level of energy literacy, because right now, because of corporate capture, and I know that sounds like a horrible word, but everyone thinks the energy transition is around large companies getting richer by investing. If the energy transition became about everyone getting access to CR, electrification, better appliances, all that kind of good stuff, and cheaper electricity, then when we do have to build transmission and other things to make it all happen, I think we'll have put people in a position that they realize that the transition's about them, not about someone else, and they've been able to experience it, so they'll understand it a lot better. And I feel like the best thing we could do for rural Australia, like we could do in rural US, is say, we're actually going to start these programs, or make sure you catch up, that everyone in the community is getting access, and we're doing things most efficiently first, and the supply side is going to be delivering to a very efficient demand side, and a very active demand side, which is, we would say technically, for everyone else, it's, oh my gosh, I'm getting all this new stuff and cheaper electricity. Sign me up.
Make it, yeah.
Make it easy. Make it about them.
Yeah.
Which I would think in this audience is not a hard message.
I'm hearing it. Okay, we've got a flip side question here. How can energy regulators, who have traditionally focused on pure efficiency, shift to acknowledge and account for consumer agency through the transition? So what needs to happen with the regulators?
Well, I think that's really important, is that we look at pricing. So one of the things that we can do is, if we say, look, what we want to make sure is that we know the most economically efficient thing to do is be able to shift demand, so that we're able to stay at a price curve, is that we provide either revenue schemes or credits, or, like I said, a very simple fixed low rate for people who are willing to participate, and then deal with the complexity at the meter and at the power, and at the, sort of the power wall, which we call the span thing. But the point would be, if you think about the internet, how we price the internet. So the internet is priced, there's an auction all the time on how much internet capacity you have in your home. You don't know that. But the internet sort of delivers amount of capacity based on what the instantaneous capability is. And so your system will slow down or speed up based on the flexibility and the system capability. I think it's sort of the same thing. You set your requirements of what you want. It's automated at the edge of your system as to what is deliverable at that moment, and then your devices respond accordingly. There's enough flexibility that we can get there. So this is where the digitalization, to me, data becomes the fuel of the decarbonized grid, and we need to make it easy and available to manage. But so I think from a regulatory standpoint, if we say people get credit for participating in these programs, but we're not going to require people to day trade energy because they don't have the time, and most of them can't, we'll make it very simple. But if you participate in these programs, you get a credit, because we need that agency in order to run the grid. We could simplify all of this, which is very much the way the internet works.
I've got another question here, so that I'm going to paraphrase this one. Sorry, guys, it's quite long. The basic premise of the question is that AUMO, in its role as ISO and TSO, is a supply-side only construct by its very nature. and how do we shift and engage and facilitate demand side management, including energy cost efficiency?
So I don't know if I agree with that hypothesis. Yeah. Okay, so AEMO is a system operator, and for the energy system to work efficiently you need to balance out supply and demand. For AEMO as an operator, they should be technically indifferent if whether the next unit of change is on the demand side or the supply side from a technical basis. From a market operation basis, they should be looking at what's the most economically efficient thing to do. So if that is shifting demand, that's what they should be calling for. So I don't think that, and I'm not saying that AEMO, because I think everyone got confused, should manage this, but they should be able to send out the signals and say, in the next hour, we need to shift 50 megawatts. And then aggregators, virtual power plants can bid into that and say, I've got 50 megawatts, I can shift. And from AEMO's perspective, if that 50 megawatts is the next most economically efficient bid unit, they should take it. That's their job. And so they're running a market, and the market runs most efficiently when demand and supply are treated as co-equals in terms of what they offer to the system.
Okay, we've got probably time for one final question. I think this one is probably, in many ways, almost the summary of our session. Can power be provided in a way that is economically efficient and equitable? Isn't that an oxymoron?
I think it's an oxymoron to say it's not. I mean, I think the most equitable way to provide power is to do it in such a way that it is equitable, in the sense that one is that you're trading the least cost unit as the next unit you take. And then secondly, you're in, as I said, which should be indifferent as to where the source of that unit is. It's what creates the public good, which is the most economically efficient one. I think the issue in equity really is an issue around access to capital. And that's an issue that I think governments have to have an obligation to help solve by programs, incentives, that make sure that access is provided. And I frankly think and I'm not saying government providing the money, I'm saying government setting up the structure so that third-party capital, investment capital, infrastructure capital can flow. And that's what I think should be our focus.
Awesome. On behalf of everybody here, thank you so much.
Thank you.
for your time.